we're at the point now where we're going to change gears a little bit and start talking about Oracle programming. Now, this is what we've done thus far. We have downloaded, and actually we don't download it anymore. We have used Oracle Apex. You should be used to using cloud tools, to writing SQL, to writing DML statements, DDL statements. Remember, DML is database markup language, and DDL is database definition language. Again, the definition language is writing code, that builds tables and things like that. And DML is the script that you write to, insert, update, delete rows. So you should be pros at that by now. If not, you should be on your way to being pros by now. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to start talking about database programming. We haven't done anything really with database objects as far as coding goes. Let me kind of define you a little bit about what a database object is. A database object is really just, and I'm going to use familiar terms, it's a thing. I mean, it would be just like if you walked outside and someone would say, point to a building. Well, what is a building? A building can be a school, it could be a Target store, it could be the gas station across the street, it could be a gymnasium, it could be anything. A building is a generic term for whatever. So if I were to ask you, write me down the definition of what a building is, you probably would look at it and struggle with it a little bit. It's just like, well, a building holds people, but it doesn't always hold people. It could hold other stuff. Some buildings have rooms, some don't. Some buildings, they play sporting events in, such as Wrigley Field by my house, some they don't. So you can kind of agonize over the definition of what a building is. That's how I am with objects. So when you hear me do some double talk, which is not unfamiliar for me, but if you hear me kind of talk in circles a little bit about some things, it's because sometimes when we're dealing with databases and we're dealing with definitions, it's hard to state the obvious. You kind of circle around a little bit. So I'm not going to really kind of pound definitions into you. I want you to kind of find your own definitions of stuff. But anyway, we're going to be using database objects. Now, database objects are used for things like database tables, which is a database object. You're familiar with those. But also, more importantly, database objects are database code. We can write database code to do things, in a database, just like you have been. I mean, you've been writing scripts to insert, update, delete stuff, and you run them as a script and all's right with the world. But guess what? You can chain all that together and make really complete database programs, just like you would do it, or you would write a Java program or a Python program, a Groovy program, name it. Name the language. You can do the same with databases. Now, there's different database languages that are very commonplace. The one we're going to use, since this is an Oracle class, or mostly an Oracle class, is we're going to use PL, that stands for Programming Language, PL SQL. PL SQL. Go to monster.com, Google Oracle PL SQL, or go to ZipRecruiter, and you'll get a little bit more of a feeling for the demand for it. PL SQL is the Oracle database language that we use to do all things databases. What can we do with PL SQL? What can you do with any other programming language, right? Someone asked you, that for you Java developers out there, what can you write in Java? Well, what do you want me to write in Java? Or it'll say, what can you write in Python? My answer is, what do you want me to write in Python? Same thing with PL SQL. What do you want me to write? Pretty much, though, database languages are considered a back-end language. They're not customer-facing, meaning that you don't run them in a web browser. People don't interact with them. They happen in the background doing database tasks, and that's why we call the database the back-end, because the back-end is really the back-end. If our building was a full-stack software, whatever, the database would be the basement or it would be in the back room. It's something that people don't necessarily see all the time, but we see it because guess what? We're database developers. That's what we do. So we're going to be concentrating on database languages or the database language PL SQL for the next few sessions or so. We're going to cover database triggers, More on that coming up with this lecture and my demo. It's going to come up in a few minutes. We're going to do or cover database stored procedures, database functions, and database packages. Not all today. It's a lot to cover. But over the next few sessions, we're going to be covering all those topics. But you know me, a little bit at a time. If we could get a couple of good solid nuggets every week, we're good. I don't like, you guys know my philosophy by now, I don't try to take a fire hose and give it to you and say, we're going to do this because it's harder, there's more rigor, we're going to cover 25 million things all today. I don't think that's the way to cover this stuff. I don't think that's the way to learn anything. I think the way to learn something is I had a professor once, and she said that, a steady pace wins the race. I like that. It sounds very bumper stickery, doesn't it? A steady pace wins the race. And that's so true, though, when it comes to learning this stuff. If you think about it, would you rather have, in an hour lecture, 15 things covered, or would you rather have a few things covered? And then you can figure out the other things as you go. And that's what I try to do for you guys. I really try to distill this. That's my class or my course management stuff. I don't think that it's a really good idea to kind of come up here in front of you and just start spouting knowledge, and this is what we're going to do, and all these 25 things. Or I'm like, you know what? 13 of these things you could get on your own. 2 of them you can't, or 2 of them you need to get started. And that's what we're doing here today with our kind of not a new topic, because every week's a new topic, but kind of a new section of our class where we're going to talk about database programming and PL/SQL with Oracle. So, what are we going to do now? For today's lecture demo, right? I call them lecture demos. Sometimes they're lectures, sometimes they're demos, sometimes they're both. So for today's lecture demo, I'm going to have a hands-on example of using database triggers. Now, I do want to point out that when I use some of these code examples may use a different course designation. Don't panic. I just don't want to redo my code examples for every course that I do. But if you see a code example with a different number on it, don't panic. I'm just using it here. I just don't want to rename things for the sake of renaming them, because then it gets too confusing for me to figure out what's going on. All right, folks. So thank you for listening to my, at least my intro. So let's start with the demo.
There we go. It looks like we're all set. So let's learn about triggers. So our objective for this class is to learn about Oracle database triggers. We're going to implement at least 2 database triggers and see how they work. So we're going to talk a little bit about the theory of triggers. We're going to program them, and we're going to see them in action. Now, the concept of a database trigger is really easy to understand, and it's important to point out that database triggers work the same or work about the same in any database management system, meaning that even though that we're doing them in Oracle today, they work basically the same in any of the major enterprise database management systems, such as SQL Server or DB2 or MySQL, any of them like that. So even though the code that we're going to write is specific to Oracle, the concept of a database trigger remains the same. Now, what a database trigger is used for is it's used by you, the database developer, to put in the database to actually kind of execute upon some sort of action on a table. Now, what does that mean in English? Now, you guys by now all know how tables work. You build the table, and your table has different columns that are in it. The employee ID, employee name, or what have you, and then you issue SQL statements. Again, you issue a select to get data from a table, maybe an insert statement to get data into a table, a delete to get data out or to delete data from a table, and an update statement. And the update statement is to update data in the table. Now, you know how to do that, or by this point, you should know how to do that. What you can do is you can implement a database trigger for some additional processing or functionality upon one of those SQL statements. In English, every time we insert a record into a specific table, let's do something. What is something? Well, something is whatever you want it to do. Or every time we update a table, let's execute a block of code. Or every time we delete a record in a table, let's execute a block of code. So what a trigger does is a trigger automatically fires upon a delete, an insert, or an update of a table. Now, don't panic if that made a little bit of sense to you or no sense at all, because we're going to do examples of about, of most of these. So let's go over some data here that we're going to be using for this example. Now, I got some data here that we're going to be using, and what I'll do is I'll make sure that you get these scripts. If not, you could contact me and you could get them. It's going to probably be easier to get you these scripts or contact me and give them to you rather than just type them in. So don't worry about just watching this for now. You're going to get to the point where you're going to have these scripts to actually write. So we're going to start with some test tables. Why? Because we're just going to need to get some test tables to get this lab to work. So we're going to have a customer table, which you see right here. Now this script should look very, very, very familiar to you. All right, what we're doing is we're building a table, or we're dropping a table called cust, and we're creating a table called cust. Now cust in it, cust has 5 different columns. It has customer number, or custno, which is a number. We have name, variable character, address, variable character. The balance is a number, and we have the current date. So on purpose, there's nothing really special about this table. Note that there's no primary keys, foreign keys, check constraints. Why aren't there? Just to keep the table simple. I just want a simple table here in which to play with triggers. It could be a complicated table. In this case, it's not. It's just a simple one. We also have another table called audit cust. And audit cust, just by coincidence, has the same table structure, where we have a customer number, we have a name, an address, a balance, and the current date. Now, again, very, very simple table. So what we're going to do is we're going to build a trigger, pardon me, say that 10 times fast, that is going to populate the audit cust table based on some action of the cust table. Why are we doing it? Because we can. Again, this is just an exercise on showing how triggers work and how we could get triggers to be associated with a table, and we can see the functionality of a table. So basically, again, what we're going to do is when something happens at a customer table, we're going to do some action to the audit cust table. So let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to build a script that's going to build our test tables here. So let me get the copy and paste the 2 tables here, put them to the clipboard, and go into Apex. And I'm going to go into SQL Workshop. And again, feel free to pause the video at any time. So I'm kind of trying to go slow and deliberate, so you'll have opportunities to do that, where you might wait for a long pause like this, right? And you can maybe pause the video and catch up if you like. So anyway, let me go into SQL Workshop. And here, let me build a new script. And I will create a new script. And let me paste this in. Again, I'm building some tables here. Let me make this a little bit larger. There we go. Nothing special. You guys have seen this before. So let me give this a script name. We'll say SC Trigger Lab. Click on run. Going to run, and we should get 2 tables that are built. Now we're just building out our test environment here. We've done nothing with triggers. So let me just do a run now to build out my lab environment. And we're waiting for Apex to complete. We're waiting more. We're waiting more. Should this take a second? And taking a long time. I'm looking at the progress bar or on the micro help on the lower left-hand side. It says waiting for apex@oracle.com. So it's running a little bit slow, but we'll give it a second to run. And we should be good. Now again, we get, table created, we're good. It doesn't drop the tables, cust and audit cust, because they don't exist yet, right? Because we're just doing this lab for the first time. But we should see table created. So now we got two test tables. We got the cust table and we have audit cust. And they look like right here. So we got audit cust and we have cust. Again, just some test tables. So let's put a record into the cust table. What we're going to do is we're going to put a record into it. So we got the cust table, and let's insert a record. So for the cust table, we'll insert a record. How about we do something like this? Insert into cust values, and we'll say values, and we'll put customer number 1, and this is Bob, and Bob lives at 123 Main Street, right, or whatever, and he has a balance of $10,000, and for the current date, watch what I'm going to do. I'm going to put in sys date. Sys date in Oracle just means right now. It's a date, data type, that just gets the current date and the time. So we should be good. And again, if you look at this code example, I got some examples up here for different triggers we're going to write. More on this in a little bit. But we're going to put one record into the cust table. So we got this guy right here. So I'm going to pause for a little bit so you can absorb, if you will, the SQL statement. Now we're going to take the SQL statement and we're going to paste it in and put this record in the customer table. So let's give it a second. Got the Jeopardy music in the background. All right, so anyway, so I'm going to copy this to the clipboard. And we're going to paste this in. So let me go back to Apex. And we'll go to SQL Workshop. And we'll navigate up from SQL Scripts. And we will go to SQL Commands. Remember, SQL Commands, we can execute just one-off commands like we have here. So you're going to hear some pregnant pauses while I'm doing this. Again, if you hear a pause, that means you can pause the video and you can kind of catch up. So let me run this. I get one row inserted. So I have one row in my customer table. Okay, big deal. I'm not going to do a select from cust because you're just going to see that this data is indeed there. So I'll save you the time. So let's review these steps. We built a cust table, which has a record in it, right? We built another table that we're just going to use to write to when we implement a trigger, which we haven't done yet. And we inserted one row into the customer table, the cust table. I'm going to start calling it the customer table. You guys get it. Alrighty then. Let me go back and start writing a trigger. So let me go to SQL Commands, and I'll go to SQL Scripts, and we're going to start writing some SQL scripts to write triggers. So I'm going to go to SQL Script and create a new one. So let's put in our trigger. And again, I'm not going to code this line by line. I'm just going to do chunks of these. And again, by the time you're watching this video, you're going to have this code. So you could do the same. And again, and I'll say this for the last time, I promise you. Well, maybe not. But yeah, feel free to pause at any time because the lab here without any pauses is about 45 minutes to an hour. But don't let that fool you. I fully expect this to take you longer than that because I want you to pause, get this working, pause, get this working. So don't get all excited when you look at the lab and say, wow, it's only 45 minutes. If you're interactive with this, it's going to be at least twice of that. All right, so let me get this code where it says this is trigger 1, and let's talk about this code. So I'm just going to go back and forth and paste this in. I'll give you a minute to do so, or to pause. Last time I mentioned that, not. So let's take a look at what this code does. Let me make this a little bit larger. Maybe not that large. There we go. Now this is what we have here. This is trigger 1, and which is, trigger 1. So here is an explanation of the code. So this is a trigger. It's a simple trigger. Notice that we've got the drop and create, just like tables. Triggers are objects, just like tables are. So we drop the trigger and then we create it. Now, when we create the trigger, we need to specify exactly 3 things. The first thing we specify is, when does this trigger get fired? Now remember, triggers by definition get fired on SQL statements. So that means that whatever in the world is accessing the customer table and is either inserting, updating, or deleting it, this trigger will automatically fire. And that's why they're called triggers. It's probably, in this politically correct day and age, a very misnamed, name for it, triggers, because they actually fire like the trigger of a gun. It just, upon some action, the trigger gets fired, the code actually gets fired off. Again, probably a bit of a misplaced name at this point, but they're called triggers, so we're just going to have to go with it. So what this says is this trigger is going to fire before a specific SQL statement, in this case, before the update on the customer table. So before an update statement actually gets executed on the customer table, let's fire this SQL. So when does this trigger get fired? Well, not by you, the developer. The system, the Oracle system, or in this case, to be more generic, the database management system is always monitoring if there's triggers on tables and will fire these triggers for you. So with that in mind, we say as database developers that triggers fire silently. They don't actually get fired upon some sort of procedure call, or we don't execute them or ask them to be executed as software developers. They automatically get executed by the database management system, in this case Oracle. So Oracle maintains a list of all the triggers and all the tables and fires them for you. So what this is saying right here is before the update statement is executed on the customer table, do this. And we'll explain what this is in a second. Now you might say this, like, well, when does before update actually happen? I mean, how do we know that update's actually going to occur? When a trigger gets fired, the update statement has already been submitted to the database. So think about it. If you're in, the SQL command line and you're executing update customer set salary equals 1 million where customer equals Bob, as soon as you hit enter to execute that update statement, what happens is the database management system will look to see if there's a trigger on that table. And then it'll look to see if there's a trigger on the update statement. And if there is, it fires it. So what happens is this gets fired upon an update statement. Now, up until your career in databases or in Oracle thus far, we're kind of spoiled. We execute an update statement or an insert or a delete, and we think that it instantaneously just kind of fires. If you're a beginner, you think that, and why not? You issue an update statement, the update actually occurs. But in reality, there's a lot of things that the database management system does before that SQL is actually executed. And one of those things is the database management system, or in this case, Oracle, will look for a trigger on that specific column, or that table. And if it finds it, it's going to execute it. And again, it does this automatically without us being the developer even saying, hey, trigger, go ahead and fire. So again, in that case, or in that realm of things, we say that triggers fire silently. So anyway, this trigger will be fired before the update statement is executed on the cust table. Again, mandatory. And we have here on line 5 for each row. A little bit more of an intermediate topic, for an intermediate video on, or an intermediate class on triggers, but let me at least approach that now since we're looking at it. Put this on the back burner for now. You could deal with this in your further career with triggers, but basically triggers can be fired for each row that's updated in the customer table, or just once, meaning that we want this trigger to fire only upon, singly upon an update of the customer table. Or here what we're saying is for every row that's going to be updated on the customer table, fire this trigger. More on that again in your further career with triggers. Then we have an optional when statement. The when statement again is optional. And in the when statement, we get to access what are called bind variables. The bind variables talk about what the current value is, which is old. It's a static variable called old, and what the value is supposed to be, being new. For example, if I want to update the customer table and set Bob's balance to 0, what the database management system will do is it'll take a look at the current balance or the old one, and it'll compare it to what the value is supposed to be. We'll go over an example of this. And if they're different, what's going to happen is this block, or the begin block, will be executed. Now I have here a very, very, very simple code example of what happens in the begin block. What can you put in the trigger for when the customer table is updated? The answer is just about anything you want. So I'm going to leave that open for now on what do you put in a trigger, because it's really sort of limited to what you want to do in a trigger. Now, in an intermediate topic with triggers, we'll talk about some design considerations and things that you should put in or should not put in a trigger. And then again, some things that might be definite no-nos. Like, again, if you know a little bit about transaction management, you don't want to put anything like that in a trigger. But for now, we're just learning about triggers. I'm assuming that if you're within the shot of my voice, that you have no experience with triggers or very, very little, and you want to learn more about them and see them in action, and that's what we're doing right here. So in this case, I have a very simple SQL statement. Insert in audit cust values old cusno, which means get what the current customer number is in the customer table, get old, or the current name, in the customer table, get the old address, or what the current address is, in the customer table, get the old balance, which is what the current balance is in the customer table, and sysdate, which is what's happening, it's a date type, which means right now. Today's date, today's time. So this is what this trigger is going to do. And I'll just go quickly now. And again, I'll do this phonetically in English, which is my, natural language. Mother tongue, as I like to say. So when we update the customer table, when an update statement gets fired, for each row that gets updated, let's look at what the new balance is. More on this in a second. Let's compare it to what the current balance is. And if it's different, what we're going to do is we're going to write a record into the audit cust table. Basically what this is doing is, in English, it's keeping track of anything that's been changed. It's looking at changes for the balance, and it's writing a record to the audit table. Now, audit tables, that get off on a semi-tangent here, is kind of a naming convention that we use to keep track of changes. So we have a table here that we call audit cust, and it's just a plain old table. When we make changes to the customer table, we're always keeping track of what the change was, or what the value was, and writing it to the audit cust table. Again, keeping like a trail, or what's called an audit trail of changes. So anyway, let's build this trigger. And again, we're building the trigger now. So we're going to say st, and we're going to say build tir build trigger. And we're going to write over this as we go. So we're going to say build trigger, and we're going to change this to trigger 2 and all that other good stuff. So I'm going to give you a second. I'm just going to save this as I go. So do the same. And let me go back into my build trigger and do a run. It should build my trigger for me. Again, we'll give it a second. I don't think there's any errors in here. That's why I pre-wrote them for you. And we get row number 1. Trigger does not exist. This is fine because it's saying that the trigger is not there. So what we're going to do is we're going to create it. So this is successful. That's fine. Don't get freaked out if it says with errors here, because this is just telling you that it can't drop a trigger because it doesn't exist yet. That's fine because it's not there. This is the first time we're running it. So now we have a trigger on the cust table. So let's see this trigger in action. So we're going to see this trigger in action by executing a SQL statement against the customer table. So let's go to SQL scripts. And from SQL scripts, we will, let's navigate to SQL commands. Now from SQL commands, again, we could look to see what is in the customer table. So we'll say, let's just take a look. So let's do select star from cust. We should see just the one record that we put in. So I click on run. And there we go. We got one record. We just entered this in. We have Bob. He lives on Main Street. He has a balance of 10,000. Now, let's look at audit cust. We shouldn't have any records in there. So let's do select star from audit cust. No data found. And this is expected. Why is there no data found? Because we have not put anything in there yet. Again, expected behavior. So let's see this trigger in action. Again, let's look at the customer table again. So we have Bob has a balance of 10,000. So let's update Bob's balance to equal 20,000. At that point, the trigger should actually fire. So let's update his balance to 20,000. So we will do that with the following SQL. We will say update cust set balance equal 20,000 where cust no is equal to 1. And I'll pause. Update cust set balance equal 20,000 where cust no is equal to 1. Now, when we execute the SQL statement, by no surprise, our balance should change. So let's run. And one row updated. So if we did a select star from cust, we would see that Bob's balance is indeed 20,000. But what happened was the following. When we issued this update statement by clicking on run, this is what the database management system did. It said, okay, I'm going to issue an update on the customer table. I'm going to set the balance equal to 20,000 where the customer number equals to 1. Before I do that, is there a trigger on the table? And guess what? There is. There's a trigger on the table. And the database management system says, is the trigger supposed to be fired in an update statement? Yes, it is. Are we updating the customer table? Yes, we are. Do I fire this trigger before I do the actual update or after I do the actual update? And the answer is before. Pardon me. So I need a cough button here. So the database management system will fire this trigger. And it'll say, all right, we'll skip for each row. Let's look at this when. Is the new balance not equal to the old balance? The old balance is 10,000. Again, we get that through the bind variable old. Let's get the old balance, or what the current balance is 10,000. The new balance is 20,000. Guess what? It's different. If it's different, continue. All right? Insert a record into this table. Put in the customer number, the name, the address, and the balance. Put in the old, which means the current customer number, the current name, the current address, and the current balance and the current date. Basically, in English, make a copy of this row before it actually changes and put it into a table, which we call audit cost. So now we should be able to see a record in audit cost. And let's see if it's there. It should be. So let's look. Let's say do a select star from audit cost. And we have one row in here. How did this row get here? We didn't put it in. The trigger did. The trigger was fired when we updated the customer table and wrote a record to audit cost. So this table, audit cost, will keep growing with the changes that we made as part of our trigger. Now, this is just one way to use a trigger. So don't think that you use triggers just to keep track of whatever changes that are made to a table. That's just the application that we're using. We're saying, hey, let's learn about triggers. Triggers got to do something. So rather than just reading about them, let's see one in action. And that's what we're doing here. What you can do in a trigger is really up to you. Now, like I said, there's going to be some best practices about what can or should be done or not done in triggers. That's beyond the scope of what we're doing. We're learning about triggers. Let's not bite off more than we can chew. Let's not go a bridge too far, right? We're using all these bad metaphors here. So let's just put our money where our mouth is and stick our nose to the grindstone and stop it, Bob. Just stop it and learn some more. All right, so we got that down. So that's a simple trigger. Now, also, let's look at another trigger here. Let's look at the second one. What we can do in trigger 2 is we can specify more than one SQL statement. So I'll give you some dead air here, and this is probably a good time to pause the video and just look at what I have highlighted, because there's going to be a quiz later. Well, not really. There's not going to be a quiz later, but there could be, but there isn't. So we have a modification here. Basically, we're doing the same thing. We're looking to see if the new balance is not equal to the old balance. And again, if it's not, we look at a couple of things. We have the variables inserting. So basically, what we have here is before insert or update. We've seen the trigger work on an update. This is how we can actually compare or look for more than one SQL statement that's being fired. Like in this case, what we're saying is when we actually not only do an update, but when an insert happens, let's do the following trigger as well. So this trigger is basically like the first trigger, except it's being more, what's the word I'm saying? We're expanding its functionality to fire upon an insert statement. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same, except for right here. We're saying if we're inserting a record, execute this code. Why do we execute this code? Because we can. Again, this is just the code that we put in here to fire if an insert statement is getting fired. And also, if we're updating, fire this block of code. Again, what you're putting in here, or what I'm putting in here, is just an example. You could have anything. So here what I'm doing is if I'm inserting, just for example, what I'm doing is I'm putting in like the new customer number. Again, if I'm adding someone, putting in their new name, address, the new balance, and the sys date. Again, because if an insert statement's getting fired, there are no old values. because that record doesn't exist in the cust table. So what we do is we use the new ones. And again, we're getting a little bit out of triggers. This is just the application of what we can do. So if we're updating, we do what we did here. We're just keeping track of, keeping track of the record that got changed. So let's get trigger 2 to work. So this kind of replaces trigger 1. If you see here that the names are the same. So even though we're calling it trigger 2 and trigger 1, those are just comments. The name of the trigger is called audit cust trigger. So we're just writing over the first one, basically. That's fine. The moral of the story here is triggers can be for more than one SQL statement. And we could branch. We could say if it's an insert statement, do this. If it's an update statement, do this. So let's get that SQL to work. To do so, let's go to SQL commands and go into SQL scripts. And let's just modify the first script for the second one. So let's go to build trigger. Let's edit build trigger and say, you know what? We don't want trigger 1 anymore. We're just going to change it. Again, I could have typed this in if I wanted, but I'm not going to. Let's run. Make sure the trigger is there. Do I want to run the script? Yeah, I do. I don't know why it prompts me twice. It's kind of a pain in the butt. And we should get trigger, drop, trigger created. That's fine. So now we basically replaced our trigger is what we did. I mean, we got a trigger called audit cust. We're calling it trigger 1 and trigger 2, but in reality, it's called the audit cust trigger. So we kind of replaced the first one with the second one. A small point, but it's worth noting. So anyway, let's go back in and test the trigger. So let's go to SQL command line. And let's test it by inserting a record into cust. We know the update works, so we don't need to test that again. Let's quickly see what we have in here. Let's do a select star from cust. Again, we should have one record in there. We have one Bob, and he's at 123 Main Street. So let's insert a record to see if that trigger is going to fire. Let's take a look at the source for that trigger again. See, we got here with this new balance here. We might want to take this out. See how it looks at the new balance, and if it's not equal to the old balance, this is going to be kind of tricky for us. And I vote we take this out just to show you that we can, because we're not really going to get an old balance there on an insert statement. The old balance isn't going to be there necessarily. So just for grins, if you're following along, let's get this when out. And again, this is a good teaching point because I can show you that when that you see there is really optional. So before we do so, or we do the example with the insert statement, let's rebuild that trigger. And again, to rebuild the trigger, we'll get back to the SQL commands. We could go back up to SQL commands and go to SQL scripts. And then from here, we can edit the script. I pasted my code in. Notice I don't have my when. Let me run the script. It's going to ask me to save it first, and we should be good. Again, and a small point, but an important one, that you may want to get rid of that when just for now. And again, it's a good teaching point because we can demonstrate here and you can learn that when is indeed optional. All right, let's go back to SQL scripts. Navigate up and go to the command line, and we could test that trigger. So let's go to, again, SQL command. And let's insert a record into cust to see if that trigger works. So we look at what's in the customer table, and let's do an insert into cust, put in values, and we'll put in customer number 2, and the name is Cassie. We will put in the address of 123 Main Street, and her balance is $1 gajillion. And then we'll put in for the current date sys date. Now this should work exactly like our SQL statement with for our update. So notice that we don't specify fire the trigger. The system will automatically pick this up and do it for us. So if I do a run and run the SQL, we should get a row inserted in the customer table, which we will verify here. We'll do select star from cust, and we'll notice now that we have Bob for customer number 1 and we have Cassie for number 2. But more importantly, that trigger fired. And again, we don't see that, which is the point. Remember, we say that triggers fire silently, which meaning they give no indication that they ran or didn't run. They're supposed to work like that because it's supposed to be like an automatic code execute upon some SQL statement. Again, some SQL statement being an insert, an update, or a delete. So if I look at the audit table, we should see the results of the trigger. So we'll say select star from cust audit. And click on run. Select star from cust. Let's do the audit again. A-U-D-I-T. Unless I deleted it, let's take a look. Oh, I think it's called audit cust, pardon me. I was going to look at the code example. If you're confused, look at the code example and you'll see it. And there we go. So basically, audit cust is keeping track of, in this case in English, if I asked you, in English, explain to me what this trigger is doing, you would say, this trigger is keeping track of all of the changes that we make to the cust table and all of the records that we're inserting into the cust table. And that would be correct. So we're using this trigger basically to create an audit trail for us. Now, there are other uses of triggers as well. We can use triggers to fix data for us. We could use triggers like we're doing here for like an audit trail to keep track of changes that were made for disaster recovery. It would be really nice to do that, where we could have triggers that keep track of all changes. So if we have to recreate data, we have a place to go for that. We can also use triggers to stop execution. For example, if an update statement is being executed and we want to stop it, we can do that as well. So triggers have really just a multitude of uses and really are only limited by what you can think about what you want to happen. Again, go back to a design aspect. And that's what triggers basically are. They're more of a design issue than anything, where you would ask yourself, what do I want to do when a record is being inserted into a table? Do I want to do anything? No? Well, then don't put a trigger on there. Do I want to do anything if something is being deleted? No? Then don't put a trigger in there. Yes? If so, then add a trigger. What do you do in the trigger? Well, what do you want to do if something is deleted from a table? It's really up to you. In this case, what we're doing is we're just writing records out, but we could do other stuff. We could fix data. We can, again, we could stop that SQL statement from being executed. There's really a lot of things that we could do. There's not really a way that you can determine it. So you just can't Google what are things that you can do with a trigger, because that's like saying, I want to paint my room, what color should I paint it? Or I want to buy a car, what should I buy? Well, what color do you like? What do you need to do? And before you pick a car, what are you going to use it for? So it's kind of an unanswerable question about what you actually use database triggers for, especially in the realm of computer science, where what we can do is we can specify exactly what we want them to do and see if it's possible. Remember, just to kind of sum things up here, that in these brief examples, I just wanted to show you just some simple triggers, how we build them, how they're executed, and how we can look to see if they executed properly. And again, large points are how to build a trigger, how to debug a trigger, notice and observe that triggers execute silently. It doesn't say, hey, I started or I ended or even I was in error. It just kind of does it automatically, quietly behind the scenes. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is let's go over the code examples that we're going to be covering. Pardon me. To support our class and this video, we're going to be using two tables. We're going to be using a table called cust, which you see here. Again, there's nothing really remarkable about this table. We're just dropping it and creating it. Notice that we're keeping things simple here. I don't have anything insofar as any constraints on my table. So I just have a customer number, I got a name, an address, a balance, and occur date. And notice I'm using fairly simple data types. I'm using just numbers, variable characters, and again for balance I have a number, and current date I have a date. And just on purpose, what I'm doing is I'm leaving these tables very, very simple to kind of abstract any complexity out of this, just to show you that there are indeed simple tables, that we're not doing anything as constraints go, such as primary keys, check constraints, foreign keys, just plain Jane tables. And again, just on a coincidence, I have the same here for audit cost. Now, again, it's just a coincidence that the table structure is the same. It doesn't have to be, but we're just using it just to keep it simple. Again, I'm trying to keep the tables, out of the way, if you would, so we could just use the tables as part of the lab environment. So if you want to follow along, if you can build these tables, that would be great. If you already have them, that would be great. If you get this video, you probably have a link there to actually download the code, or you could email me and I could give you the code to build these tables, and then you could just run this as a script to do so. But I already have these tables in my lab environment, which we're going to be using shortly. Now, the lab environment that we're going to be using is SQL Express for Oracle. So let's take a look at what we see there. So let me kind of navigate down to that script. Let me close some things up here. So anyway, not that script, but the environment. So we have here, we got SQL scripts, SQL commands. We have basically our Oracle Apex environment. So let's see what we have in those two tables. So I'm going to quickly go into SQL commands and just take a look at what I have in those two tables. We have cust and we have audit cust. So I'm just going to do a quick select star from cust, and then we'll look at the customer table and just note that we have two records in there. We have Bob and we have Cassie, and then we got their addresses. Again, just two records, nothing really to see here. Now let's also take a look at the table that we have audit cust. So we'll do a select star from audit cust, and here we're going to see again that we got a couple records in here as well. So for the purpose of our labs, we can kind of possibly just ignore the data that's in both of these tables and kind of start with some new ones. Now let's talk a little bit more about triggers. Now what a trigger is a trigger, pardon me, say that 10 times fast after a few martinis for lunch, right? Now what a trigger is a piece of database code that gets executed upon some sort of action to a table. So what we're going to do is we're going to be using for our test table, or our table that we're going to be putting the trigger on, is we're going to be using the cust table. So if I do a select star from cust, you're going to notice again I got a couple records in there. But let's talk about what could happen to this table. Now there are three different types of SQL statements that can be executed on this table, right? Well, four if you include select. But let's talk about the SQL that can occur on this table that would do things such as alter the data. So there's only really 3 clauses, SQL clauses, that are possible, right? You have update, which will update a column in this table. You have delete, and a delete presumably will delete one record or potentially more than one record of data from this table. And then we have, what did I forget? And then we have insert. Now insert will insert a record, which is still changing the table. So we have 3 different SQL statements that will change the data in this table. SQL insert, SQL delete, and a SQL update. And forget about select for now. Select, yes, it's a SQL statement. It'll grab data from the table, but it does nothing insofar as changing any of the data. So what do we do? Now, in our case, if we want to perform some kind of action upon this table changing, such as an insert, an update, or a delete, what we can do is we can install or attach, they're the same thing, they're synonymous with each other, a trigger on the table. Now again, what that means is what we're going to do is we're going to put some code on the table that's going to execute upon a SQL insert, update, or delete. Now, why do we want to do this? Well, you can go your entire life and your entire database career and not worry about any of this foolishness. You can say, you know what, we're not using triggers at all. And certainly you'd be fine. But you may find that there's certain things that you may want to do every time something is changed within a table. For example, if we change the address or the balance for a customer that we see here, we may want to keep track of the change, in another table somewhere, like audit cust or cust changes or something. We may want to put a trigger on the cust table that keeps track of these changes. Or we may want to have some sort of data cleansing. For example, how about the scenario where, how about we have a rule that we can't update a customer balance to be more than $1 million for whatever reason. What we can do is we could put a trigger on the table to enforce that, to say, you know what, if someone tries to insert or update something that's more than $1 million, how about this, make it $1 million? To say it could only be a maximum of $1 million, and if it's more than that, make it $1 million. Or how about this, balances can't be less than 0. And if a balance attempts to be less than 0, make it 0. We can also do things such as enforce security. For example, we could put in row level security or column level security that names and addresses may not be modified if a balance is maybe greater than 10,000. Or if the balance is less than 10,000, we're allowed to change the name and the addresses. So what triggers allow us to do from a high level is they allow us to put in some business rules that we want to apply every time something is attempting to change our data, either via an insert statement, an update statement, or a delete statement. Now, what you do in the trigger really is completely up to you. So in this short class, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you 2 different ways that we can implement triggers. So let me go and pan to the code examples. And what I will do is if you contact me somehow, I will give you the code to put these triggers in so you don't got to actually code them, one at a time or like one line at a time. So I called these guys trigger 3 and trigger 4. Forget trigger 1 and trigger 2. They were used somewhere else. You're not going to see them here. So we're going to see trigger 3 and trigger 4. Let's take a look at trigger number 3. And again, I'll put in some long pauses in here so you can catch up if you like. But trigger 3 is going to be a trigger that's going to enforce a couple of different business rules. So I'll let you look at that for a second. I'll give you about 10-15 seconds of dead air, and I'll continue. And also, when I leave dead air here in situations like this, that's your cue to pause the video if you like, and then you can continue when you get a inkling of how this code works. So let me give you some dead air to pause the video if you'd like to. Okay, so let's review what this code segment does here. We have the code to drop the trigger. Again, we name this custom name upper. So what this does is what we're doing here is just dropping a trigger called custom name upper, and then what we're doing is we're basically building the table out. Now, what we're doing here is we're doing some sort of data manipulation, or data, which a lot of times is called massaging. So basically what's happening here is when we're inserting or updating the name on the customer table, again, this is important. So this is going to be fired on an insert statement or an update statement. So basically what we're doing here is if we're inserting or updating, inserting a record or updating the name of the customer table, what we're doing here is a couple of things. The first thing that we're doing is we're taking the name that we get via the new bind variable. We're getting the name from the, again, from the insert of the update statement. And then what we're looking at is we're saying, okay, we're getting the name and we're converting it all to uppercase characters. So again, this would be the rule, such as in the customer table, the name has to be in uppercase. Now, a trigger is a good place to enforce this because we can fix the data if we need to without necessarily putting a constraint on the customer or on the name column in the customer table. Like, for example, we could have put a constraint on here that if the name is not in uppercase characters, just to reject it. But we're not doing that here. What we chose to do in this code example from a design perspective is to put a trigger on the actual table. So what the trigger is doing is the trigger is saying, all right, rather than failing if the name isn't in uppercase, let's just quietly make it in uppercase and not make a big fuss about it. In English, meaning don't fail the SQL statement or throw an exception, but just quietly fix the data if you can. And that's what we're doing from a high level architecture for this trigger. We're saying basically in this line of code, if the name that we're trying to insert or update is not in uppercase, just make it in uppercase. And again, since triggers are fired silently, which meaning that we don't specify, okay, trigger run, and it doesn't say I've started or I've ended, we can put that functionality in a trigger because that's something that we might want to do every time that an update or an insert statement runs on the customer table. We want to quietly just take a look at what the name is, and then if it's not in uppercase characters, we make it in uppercase characters. And then we have another rule here that we're saying, all right, let's look at the balance that we're actually updating or inserting. If the balance is less than 1,000, what we're doing is we're making it 1,000. Why? Well, it's our trigger. We could do what we want to. So basically what we're doing with this trigger is we're using this trigger to enforce business rules. Business rules being business rule 1, if the name is not in uppercase characters, make it in uppercase characters. And make no, as I'll say, use a slang term, just make no more fuss about it. Don't throw an exception. Allow the update statement to continue and just quietly make the name in uppercase characters. Then what we're saying is we have another rule, taking a look at the balance. If the balance is less than 1,000, we make it 1,000. Now we could have implemented this as a constraint maybe, but here what we're doing is we're putting some business logic in as a trigger. Pardon me, I should have a cough or a burp button, huh? If the balance is less than 1,000, just make it 1,000. So you're getting to see from an architecture standpoint some of the things that we use triggers for. And again, what we're doing for here, or using a trigger for here, is we're enforcing two business rules. Also, take a look at this as we can put the trigger, again, this is an important line of code that I've highlighted, before or after the update statement or the insert statement fires on a specific column in the customer table. What we're going to do for grins is I'm going to get rid of this of name. So we're going to fire this if anything gets updated, not just the name. Okay, so we have this is trigger 3. That's just a comment. Let me copy this code and paste it into Apex and run this as a database script. And I will do that here. I will go to SQL Workshop, SQL Commands, I will build a database script. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to use a script I already have called build trigger. Actually, no, I'll leave that. Let me build a new one. Sorry. I kind of like corrected myself there. Let me build a new script. So I paste in my code, and I'll give you a chance to do the same. And when you're done, I'm going to call this SC, and I'm going to say biz rule trigger. I'll give you a second to get this working, or to actually get this compiled. And hold on, let me go back to show you what it looks like. I'll give you a second. Now, this should just compile fine when we're ready. We haven't done so yet, but as long as you have the cust table there, we should be good. But I'll give you a second to make sure that you have the cust table there. If not, like I said, you can contact me if you don't got the code for the cust table, and I'll be glad to give it to you. Let me give you one more second, and we're going to run this to compile the trigger and build the trigger. All right, so now let me run this script to build the trigger. Remember, building the trigger doesn't execute it. It just compiles it and it gets it ready to go. The trigger is going to be fired upon an insert statement or an update. So let me run the trigger to make sure it compiles okay. So I'm not running it, I'm compiling it. And I'm looking at my message bar here. It says waiting for Apex. We're going to wait for it to compile. So I'm not locked up, I'm just waiting. I didn't know that my trigger took this long to compile, but we'll give it a shot. There we go. And we got a bit of an issue here where it doesn't like cust name upper. So let me run this again just to make sure we got this in the right order. Let me go to edit script. Looks like it executed these in the wrong order. It should do the drop first. Let me do this again. It should drop the trigger, then create it. And we're good. It just looks like it executed in the wrong order. You're going to see that. And again, let's kind of go off on a little bit of a side trip here, a little bit of a field trip. Sometimes, if you have multiple different lines in a SQL script, if Apex is busy, once in a great while, it'll execute them out of order. If it does, just look at this and make sure it executes them in the correct order. And as I famously say, and nobody will get hurt. We're good. All right, so we got the trigger. That's going to be fired before the insert of the update. So let's see the trigger in action. I'm going to go and update a record. How about this? We go to SQL scripts, navigate up all the way to SQL commands, and we're going to update a record. Let me do the following. Let's do a select star from cust. All right, so we got two different records here. We have Bob and Cassie. So let's update Bob's balance. Let's take a look at the trigger and see what the rule is again. Now we have a rule here that if we try to update a balance to be less than 1,000, we make it 1,000. Why? Because the trigger says so. It's our trigger. We can do what we want. All right, so let's do how about this? Let's update balance, update cust, set balance equal 0, where custno is equal to 1. So what we're doing here is we're trying to set Bob's balance to 1. To 0. You would have caught that though. Update cust, set balance equals 0, where cust number equals 1. So basically, we're trying to make this into 0. So we click on Run to run our SQL statement. Our SQL statement runs. And when we look at our data, I'll select star from cust. We get to look at our data, and we should notice that Bob's balance is 1,000. Well, why is it 1,000? Well, it's 1,000 because what we did is we tried to set it to 0, and our trigger says we can't set it to 0. Let's make it 1,000. And also, kind of as a side trick to this, the Bob became uppercase here. Even though we didn't update it, what's happening is it took the Bob and made it uppercase. But let's try that. Let's try to put a new record in here. Let's do an insert into cust values, and we'll put in, how about customer number 3, and the name is, we are going to put in Mike Jordan. Got to be like Mike, right? Address, we'll put 123 Main Street, and we'll make Mike's balance 0, and we'll put, how about sysdate for the current date. And if you don't know what sysdate is just the current date of the system as far as the date timestamp goes. So we got insert in the cust values. We got 3 Mike Jordan, 123 Main Street, his balance is 0, and sysdate. So I'm going to pause the video metaphorically, right? Because you're going to actually pause it, not me. I'm not actually watching a video. I'm doing this live, so I really can't pause myself. But when I insert this, what is this record going to look like? Well, let's take a look. First of all, the trigger is going to be fired, right? Because we're doing an insert on the cust table. And first thing it's going to do, well, it's going to evaluate. It's going to say, do we have an insert or an update on the cust table? And we do. What it's going to do is it's going to take the name, converted all to uppercase characters, then it's going to look at the balance. And if the balance is less than 0, it's going to make it, less than 1,000, it's going to make it 1,000. And again, triggers fire silently. Nothing indicates that this happens. And that's kind of the point, where triggers quietly just, in this case, just fix the data. And that's how they work. So if I go and take a look at my code or my SQL statement, I'm inserting in the cust values 3 Mike Jordan, 123 Main Street, 0 sysdate. So I click on run. 1 row inserted. Now if I take a look at the customer table, like select star from cust, notice Mike Jordan is in all uppercase because the trigger made him in all uppercase and made the balance 1,000. So this trigger fired and successfully, as far as we're concerned, changed the name to uppercase and the balance equal to 1,000. Let me give you a minute to do a pause if you want to pause the video and run that again. All right, so let's look at some other things that we can do with the trigger. So we use the trigger there to enforce a couple of business rules. We can also do things such as stop processing. For example, let's just say we have an update, an insert, or a delete that we want to stop. Like, for example, how about we have a rule that balances cannot be, like right here, we have a rule that if a balance is less than 1,000, make it 1,000. How about this? If we could take it a step further in this example and say if the balance is less than 0, just don't even execute the SQL statement. Don't modify the balance. Just stop it. You see this type of trigger in a lot of database security applications where you might look at certain things on the system that aren't allowed to happen. How about this? Deletes aren't allowed on the customer table. And let's just say we have a rule that we don't really delete customers, we just make them inactive. So therefore, if a delete was to be executed on the customer table, we would consider that suspicious. Or how about something else suspicious? We don't update balances to less than 0, or we don't update balances more than $1 million. Anything outside of that range would be considered suspicious. Or we might have something like we don't allow raises or balances to be changed to more than 5% of what they currently are. In those instances, what we can do is we can use a trigger to catch those suspicious activities and perhaps create some logging information, or even more to stop the execution of the actual SQL, saying don't do it, don't execute this insert, this update or delete, and we can use a trigger to do so. So let's look at some code that does that. So let's look at our code examples. And again, I got an example here that said that we have for trigger 4. And again, for here we got pos cust bail. So we got a trigger here before insert or update on cust. So what happens here is this trigger is going to fire on the customer table for every insert or update. And we have an exception declared here. If you don't know what exceptions are, you can look them up. But here we have a different block, and we're declaring an exception. Now, again, exceptions, if you're unfamiliar with them, it's the subject of it's a different subject covered primarily beyond the scope of what we're doing here. But exceptions are system errors, and we can do things such as assign them numbers and functionality. So what we're doing here is we're looking at the balance. Now, if the balance is less than 0, what we're doing here is we're raising an error. Raise is basically throwing an exception or saying that there's a system error message that has occurred. When that happens, processing falls to the exception block. And in the exception block, what I'm doing here is I have a trigger that's saying if we have a neg bal error, which means that the balance here is less than 0, what we're doing is I'm calling the function raise application error, and there I'm giving it a number. Again, anything in the range of negative 2001 to negative, I think, 2100 are error messages that we're allowed to use in Oracle, and then some text. Anytime that you raise an application error in a trigger, what happens is this automatically stops the execution of the SQL statement. In English, it says don't continue. If you're inserting a record, don't do it. If you're updating a record, don't do it. It short circuits it. It just says don't allow this to happen. So basically, we have a trigger here that would be used in as part of an overall database security sort of architecture. Well, what we're saying here is if for some reason there's an insert or an update statement on the customer table coming from anywhere, it doesn't matter if it's from someone's code, if it's a web application, if someone logs in and is trying to execute the SQL, anywhere in the world, if there's an update or an insert statement that is executed in our customer table, if for any reason that statement is trying to get our balance less than 0, don't do it. What we would do as part of database security administrators, if we could put on our database security administration hat for a second, is we probably would have dozens of these triggers on our database management system on our tables. So what we would do is we'd say, oh, you know what, we would identify a couple dozens of things that we would consider suspicious, and we would want to literally short circuit the SQL from actually executing, and presumably this would be one of them. So here what we're doing is we're saying, you know what, if we have an opportunity or if we have the situation where we have a SQL statement that's updating something less than 0, don't do it. So let's compile this trigger and see if it works. So let's go back to SQL commands. And from SQL commands, go into SQL scripts, and let me build a new script. I'm going to say new or create. There's me. And you've already seen this code. I copied and pasted it in. I'll call this script SC, and I'll say prevent SQL. Now remember, this is just the script name. We can call this anything we want. We're saving the script. It's not the trigger name. The trigger name is here called pos_cust_bail. So this is just a script name that we're using just to kind of compile this. So let me compile the trigger, make sure we get no errors, and we shouldn't because it's been pre-tested by me. And this is fine. It's just saying we can't drop it because it doesn't exist. And then it creates it. So we're okay. So we have the trigger. So now we can test it. So let's go to the customer table. So let's go to SQL scripts. And from SQL scripts, we'll navigate up one more and then go to SQL commands. So let's look to see what we have in the customer table by doing a select star from cust. So let's do the following. Let's make Cassie's balance less than 0. The trigger should fire. So if I say update, how about this balance? And we'll say, update cust. And let's do set balance equal -100 or 1000 where, and we'll say cust no is equal to 2. And we don't need the semicolon. Pardon me. I really do not like these notifications. All right, update cust, set balance equal -1000 where cust no is equal to -2. So let's run the SQL statement. And take a look at this. This looks like an error message, like, oh my gosh, it's broken. But no, this is ours. This is our functionality and our messages. Remember I said in a statement early in this video that triggers run silently, and they do, unless we raise an exception. And then we're going to get these error messages. Again, these are ours. Aura, -2001. Negative not allowed. And it says the error was in the execution of the trigger, and it shows the update statement. It says update set balance equals -1000 where cust no equals 2. So this isn't really an error. It's a good error. I mean, well, it is an error. Let's take a step back. It's an error, but it's an error that we actually said that we want to introduce. We're saying it's an error. SQL wouldn't mind this. It's just saying, well, if you want to update the customer balance to -1000, there's no check constraint that says that we can't do it. But we being the database developer, has a trigger that says don't allow this. So we, as part of the trigger, said consider this an execution error. So when you say error during execution, that is us. That is us raising the exception in the trigger. So this is working as expected, working as advertised. This is BOU, business, or BAU, business as usual. This is something that we expect to happen. So anyway, and we could see now that if we looked at Cassie, that her balance hasn't changed. Why? Because we raised the exception in the trigger, and that prevents that SQL from running, that SQL update from running. So if we said, select star from cust, and then run, notice Cassie's balance has not changed. So we're all good. So that trigger prevented that change from happening. Again, that's a great example of how to use triggers to enforce database security. In this case, we identified something that was suspicious prior to something bad happening, and we put a trigger in to prevent that. So if you're putting together a data protection or a data security strategy, triggers are a big part of that. Because what you could say is like, you know what, let's put triggers in to keep track of the changes that are being made. And also we can keep track of, or pardon me, prevent harmful or suspicious SQL form statements from even being executed. And we did that. We protected our data by saying, you know what, we don't like this SQL. In a regular environment, balances never, ever, 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 pinky swear, pinky swear, pinky swear, should never be less than 0. So rather than keeping track of the SQL, we just prevented it, saying don't allow that SQL to happen. All right, let's review a couple things that we did, and we're going to wrap this up. So we went over the tables that we built. Again, we just have the cust table and the audit cust, which we really didn't use in this example, but we have the code for it here. But we have the customer table, so you have the code to build it there, and we went over 2 triggers. The first trigger, which we have, this is trigger 3, was used just to enforce business rules. Again, quietly, just make sure that the name is all in uppercase characters. Again, no big whoop, no big fuss. If it's not in uppercase characters, it's not an error. Just put it in uppercase characters and get on with your life. And we're doing the same with the balance. If the balance is less than 1,000, just make it 1,000. Now, the second one was a little bit more dramatic. Where trigger number 4 is more dramatic, where we're saying, you know, if the balance is less than 0, don't change it to something. Just don't allow that SQL to continue. Hey, you stop. Don't do this. That's why we're executing this trigger before an insert or update, because it gives us a chance to say, you know what, we're being fired from an insert or an update statement. Stop it. Short circuit it. Cut it out. Don't execute it. Why? Because we're raising an error and we're raising an exception error. That basically says just don't do it. Stop it. So we have 2 different uses of a trigger here. Enforcing business rules, and then the second one, enforcing database security to catch suspicious activity before it happens and not allow that to occur. So that is the lecture and the class that we have on some intermediate uses of triggers, maybe beginning uses of triggers / intermediate uses of triggers, and how we could get triggers to run. So in this video, we used a test table called cust. We learned how to compile a trigger, how to save it as a database script, how to make sure that it actually compiles correctly, and then we saw the 2 triggers in action. The one trigger we saw enforcing business rules, where it made Mike Jordan all capital and changed his balance to 1,000 because we tried to make his balance 0. And also, we had a scenario where we saw the second trigger in action, where we tried to update a customer, and in this case Cassie, and we tried to give her a negative balance. And then the trigger fired and said, no way, don't do that. So hopefully you found this useful. I bid you all a very well rest of the day, and thank you for watching.